7 decades since the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, around 80 new fragments of the ancient texts have been revealed to the public. Archaeologists in Israel made the monumental find during a mission involving the scaling of cliffs and searching hundreds of caves.
In 1979, a diver descended into the Dead Sea. Not far. The Dead Sea isn't deep. What he saw at the bottom, he didn't report publicly for years. Not because it wasn't significant, because he didn't have a framework for what it meant. The Dead Sea is one of the most extreme environments on Earth. Almost nothing can survive in it. No fish, no seaweed, no bacteria that science had identified, until recently. And yet, for decades, researchers kept finding things beneath that water that had no business being there. The water is leaving, and it is taking nothing with it. The Dead Sea is dying. The Dead Sea is disappearing. Not metaphorically, not slowly in some geological sense that takes a million years. Visibly, year by year, the water level drops by more than 1 meter every single year. 1 meter every year. Since the 1960s, the Dead Sea has lost more than a third of its surface area. The southern basin, the part you see in most postcard photographs, is no longer a natural body of water. It is kept alive artificially by the potash mining industry, which pumps water in from the north to sustain its evaporation operations. The real Dead Sea, the northern basin, the ancient one, the one that has been here for 3 million years, is retreating, and nobody can stop it. The primary cause is the Jordan River. For thousands of years, the Jordan carried freshwater south and fed the sea. Today, more than 90% of the Jordan's flow is diverted before it arrives. For agriculture, for cities, for industry. What remains arrives heavily polluted, partially sewage-treated, a fraction of its historical volume. The sea is drinking from an empty cup. And as the water retreats, it leaves things behind. When freshwater from underground aquifers meets the exposed salt layers beneath the former seabed, it dissolves them. The ground becomes hollow. And then, without warning, the surface collapses. More than 6,000 sinkholes have opened along the Dead Sea's shores in the past few decades. Some are small. Some are the size of swimming pools. Some swallow entire roads. Some swallow more than that. But the sinkholes were not the strangest thing the receding water uncovered. The first discoveries. Diving in the Dead Sea is not like diving anywhere else. The salinity, nearly 10 times that of ocean water, makes the environment so dense that standard diving equipment fails. Standard buoyancy control doesn't work. Your body wants to float. The water resists you. Descending requires effort that feels counterintuitive and physically wrong. Most divers don't go deep. Most divers don't go at all, which made what a team of scientists discovered in 2010 so startling. A joint research team from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the German Institute for Geosciences descended to the floor of the Dead Sea, something that had rarely been done with scientific rigor. They were studying the geological record in the sediment. Layers of history compressed into the lakebed like pages in a book. What they found was not geological. There were freshwater springs on the floor of the Dead Sea. Not one. Several. This sounds like good news. Life in a lifeless sea. But researchers weren't celebrating. They were recalibrating. Because if there were active freshwater springs on the seafloor, springs significant enough to sustain biological communities, what else might those springs have affected over thousands of years? What else might have been preserved, or concealed, or altered by pockets of non-saline water in a sea defined by salt? The answer began emerging as the water retreated. In the areas now exposed by the falling water level, field archaeologists began finding evidence of something that had been submerged, possibly for centuries. Not artifacts. Structures. The Dead Sea sits at the center of one of the most archaeologically layered regions on Earth. Jericho, possibly the oldest continuously inhabited city in human history, sits a few kilometers north. Masada overlooks the sea from the west. Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, is carved into the cliffs above the northwestern shore. This is ancient ground. People have lived here, fought here, built here and died here for at least 10,000 years. But the settlements known to archaeology were always assumed to be on the shoreline, on the land beside the water, not beneath it. What was found in the exposed lakebed near the southern basin in the years following 2015 began to suggest that the Dead Sea's historical shoreline was significantly different from what researchers assumed. That settlements they had no record of had existed on land that was later swallowed by water, and that the water and the extraordinary salt content that defines the sea had preserved what was beneath it in ways that standard archaeology could not predict. They were finding objects that should not have survived. Organic material, fabric, substance, in a region where the climate alone should have destroyed anything biological within decades. The salt had acted as a preservative. The sea had acted as a vault. And then, the water dropped further. The terrifying discovery. By 2019, certain areas of the former lakebed that had been underwater within living memory were now exposed land. Researchers could walk on ground that divers had once descended to. And what they found on that ground changed the character of this story. There are references in ancient texts, Jewish, Roman, Byzantine, to communities that existed along the Dead Sea's shores in antiquity. Communities that vanished from the historical record. Not gradually, not through conquest or migration. They simply stopped being mentioned. Researchers had always assumed these were documentation errors. Historical exaggeration. Geographic imprecision in ancient cartography. The emerging lakebed began complicating that assumption. In cave systems newly accessible along the receding shoreline, researchers began finding evidence of human occupation. Not visitation. Occupation. Hearth sites. Storage niches. In some cases, markings on cave walls that bore no resemblance to the decorative cave art catalogued elsewhere in the region. These were functional markings. Utilitarian. The kind you make when you need to remember something, or warn someone, or indicate that this space has a specific purpose. Then came what researchers privately began calling the corridor. It is a depression, long, narrow, running approximately north-south. Along its length, at irregular but seemingly intentional intervals, stones. Not scattered, not geologically placed. Arranged. No press release was issued about the corridor. No academic paper was published about it in the year it was discovered. This is not unusual in archaeology. Sites require documentation, verification, peer review. Premature publication contaminates the scientific process. But the researchers who were present in those early weeks described something specific about the atmosphere at the discovery site. Not excitement, discomfort. What the corridor contained at its northern terminus, the end nearest the current waterline, was a subsurface cavity, not a natural void. The walls of the cavity showed evidence of deliberate construction. Stone-lined, sealed, originally, with material that had partially dissolved when the water retreated, which is what had made it visible. Inside the cavity were remains. The Dead Sea's extraordinary chemistry, the hypersaline environment, the mineral concentration, the near-total absence of the biological decomposition organisms that exist in normal aquatic environments, had preserved what was inside with a degree of completeness that no one had anticipated. Preserved human remains. Multiple individuals. Based on preliminary physical analysis, not adults. Researchers working the site have been careful, in subsequent discussions, not to speculate publicly about the nature of the deposit. They describe it as a deliberate interment site showing unusual characteristics inconsistent with standard burial practices identified at known regional sites from the relevant historical period. That language is precise. It is chosen carefully. What it describes, if you read it slowly, is a burial that does not match anything else found in the region, in a location that should not have been accessible for burial, because it was, until recently, underwater. Which means the burial predates the water. The sea rose. It covered everything. It preserved it. And then, slowly over decades, then faster, the sea fell and returned what it had kept. What no one has yet answered, publicly, is why the individuals were there. In a sealed cavity. At the terminus of a deliberately constructed feature. In a location that was subsequently submerged. whether they went willingly or not, whether the submersion was anticipated by whoever placed them there, or whether it was the event that sealed the record. Theories and implications. The Dead Sea's history is long enough that almost any discovery can be credibly situated within multiple interpretive frameworks. There is the geological framework. The sea's water level has risen and fallen multiple times in the past several thousand years. Periods of lower water, up to and including levels significantly below the current surface, have been documented in the sediment record. Human settlements could have established themselves on what was then shoreline, only to be swallowed when the water rose again. This is not speculative. It is the documented pattern. There is the archaeological framework. The region surrounding the Dead Sea contains some of the most significant archaeological discoveries in the modern era. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Masada. The ancient city of Jericho. The copper and silver hoards found in cave systems above the western shore. The discovery of submerged or previously submerged structures would not be surprising in principle. What makes the current discoveries unusual is their location, not on the established ancient shorelines, but in areas whose submersion predates written archaeological record for this site. There is the environmental framework. And this is where the implications become genuinely serious in ways that extend beyond archaeology. The Dead Sea's minerals, bromine, potash, magnesium, are commercially extracted at industrial scale by operations on both the Israeli and Jordanian shores. These industries simultaneously depend on the sea's existence and accelerate its disappearance through the evaporation process their operations require. What researchers have documented, and what receives significantly less public attention, is what may be trapped in the deep sediment layers of the seafloor. The Dead Sea sits in one of the world's most geologically active regions. The Dead Sea Transform, the fault system that runs beneath the valley, is seismically active. The region's industrial history includes decades of chemical operations. Researchers studying the deep sediment have identified anomalous gas pockets in the lakebed. Not oxygen, not the standard gases of biological decomposition. Methane, hydrogen sulfide. Gases associated with deep geological processes, but also with certain types of industrial contamination. The precise origin of these pockets, whether geological, biological, industrial, or some combination, is not definitively established. What researchers do note is that as the water level drops and the pressure on the deep lakebed decreases, the stability of these pockets changes. And then there is the biblical framework. The Dead Sea appears in texts across multiple religious traditions as a place of consequence. A place where something occurred, something significant enough to be encoded in the foundational narratives of 3 of the world's major religions. Archaeological work at sites near the Dead Sea has identified evidence, ash layers, vitrified building materials, skeletal remains showing high-temperature damage, that some researchers interpret as consistent with a catastrophic event of significant scale and speed. The nature and cause of that event remain debated, but the evidence that something occurred, something that ended settlements suddenly enough to leave physical evidence of trauma and extreme temperature, is documented in peer-reviewed literature. One of these frameworks, geological, archaeological, environmental, historical, provides a complete explanation for what is currently emerging from the Dead Sea's receding waters. That may be the most honest thing that can be said. The sea is revealing things. We are still learning how to understand them. Final psychological ending. The Dead Sea is, in one very precise sense, one of the best preserved archives on Earth. The chemistry that makes it inhospitable to life makes it extraordinary for preservation. Organic material. Brick. Biological tissue. The salt holds things. The density holds things. The extreme environment holds things in states of suspension that normal conditions would not permit. The Dead Sea is, in one very precise sense, one of the best preserved archives on Earth. The chemistry that makes it inhospitable to life makes it extraordinary for preservation. Organic material. Metal. Fabric. Biological tissue. The salt holds things. The density holds things. The extreme environment holds things in states of suspension that normal conditions would not permit. What researchers are confronting, as the water retreats and the archive opens, is not simply a set of archaeological discoveries. It is a shift in what the Dead Sea represents. It was always understood as an endpoint, a terminal body of water. Water flows in, nothing flows out, the minerals concentrate, the salinity increases, life becomes impossible. An ending. What researchers are confronting as the water retreats and the archive opens is not simply a set of archaeological discoveries. It is a shift in what the Dead Sea represents. It was always understood as an endpoint, a terminal body of water. Water flows in, nothing flows out, the minerals concentrate, the salinity increases, life becomes impossible. An ending. The water level will continue to fall. The projections agree on this even when they disagree on the rate. The southern basin, artificially maintained, may eventually be abandoned by the industry that sustains it, because the economics of extraction against a falling source eventually cease to function. The northern basin, the ancient one, will continue its retreat. And whatever the sea is holding in the deep sediment, in the layers of compressed history, in the sealed pockets, in the preserved cavities, will eventually be exposed. The Dead Sea has been described in ancient texts as a wound in the earth, a place where the land itself is broken. Geologically, this is accurate. The sea sits in a rift valley, a place where the tectonic plates of Arabia and Africa are pulling apart. The ground here is, in the most literal sense, coming apart at the seams. What is being exposed as the water retreats is not simply archaeology. It is the record of every period, every civilization, every event, every catastrophe that touched this valley and then was covered and kept. The Dead Sea is not disappearing. It is opening. And what it has kept, for centuries, for millennia, under meters of brine and salt and geological pressure, is only now beginning to return to the surface. We do not know everything it has held. We do not know everything it will release. The water is leaving. It is taking nothing with it. What do you think the Dead Sea is still hiding? Is what's emerging the result of ancient civilization, communities that built, lived, and vanished before the water rose to cover them? Is it evidence of something that happened here, fast, catastrophic, and still not fully understood? Or is there something else down there, something the sea isn't finished revealing? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if this changed how you think about what's hidden beneath the places we call dead, share it, because there are people who need to ask these questions. Subscribe if you want to go deeper, because the Dead Sea is not the only place on Earth where the water is falling. And it is not the only place with secrets beneath the surface.